Tonight you will receive teachings that have brought comfort and clarity to restless hearts for over 25 centuries. Each story we share tonight is a doorway, and you don't need to understand the architecture to walk through it. These are truths that speak not to your thinking mind, but to something deeper that already knows the way home. I'm truly happy you're here with us today for these teachings. In choosing to be present for this wisdom, you're joining a lineage of seekers stretching back through time, all looking for the same thing: peace in the midst of life's storms. Before we begin, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? Please share in the comments. Buddhism is sometimes seen as mysterious or foreign, but its core message is remarkably universal. The Buddha simply taught what he discovered through direct experience: that suffering is optional, that peace is always available, and that the way forward isn't through getting more or being better, but through seeing clearly what's already true. As you listen tonight, let go of any pressure to learn or remember. These teachings aren't information to store away. They're invitations to experience something right now, in this very moment. Let them wash over you like waves, each one carrying away a little more of what you don't need. Take this moment to care for your comfort. Feel yourself being completely supported. Notice your breath flowing easily, naturally, without any help from you. Everything is taking care of itself. Let your body release with each exhale. Feel the softening happen on its own. Your forehead smooths. Your shoulders settle. Peace begins to arrive. Take a slow, deep breath in, welcoming this moment exactly as it is, and release, letting everything else fall away. Thank you for being here. Let's begin our journey together with our first teaching. The Buddha once told his students something that freed them from years of struggle. He said, "You are not your thoughts." This seems obvious when you first hear it, but sit with it for a moment. You are not your thoughts. If you were your thoughts, who would be the one observing them? When a worried thought passes through your mind, there's the thought itself, and there's the awareness that notices the thought. That awareness that's closer to who you really are. We spend so much energy believing every thought, defending our thoughts, identifying with our thoughts. When a thought says, "I'm not good enough," we believe it. When a thought says, "This will never work," we accept it as truth. We let our thoughts push us around like leaves in the wind. But what if you could watch your thoughts the way you watch clouds moving across the sky? Present, but not disturbed by them. Aware, but not controlled by them. This is what the Buddha called freedom. Not freedom from thoughts, but freedom from being enslaved by them. Let's explore a story that shows this teaching beautifully. There was a farmer named Hideaki who worked his land diligently, waking before dawn and laboring until dusk. His son, Daichi, seemed to be his opposite, lazy, sleeping late, avoiding hard work whenever possible. Hideaki was ashamed of his son and frustrated by what he saw as wasted potential. "That boy will never amount to anything," Hideaki would complain to his neighbors. "I work myself to exhaustion while he lounges under trees and daydreams. He has no ambition, no drive, no sense of responsibility." The neighbors agreed with Hideaki's assessment. They saw Daichi as a disappointment, a young man who would never succeed because he lacked his father's work ethic. Some pitied Hideaki for having such a lazy son. Others judged Daiichi harshly, predicting he would become a burden on his family and community. What no one knew, including Hideaki, was that Daiichi spent his time under those trees observing. While appearing to do nothing, he was watching everything. How water moved across the land, which areas stayed moist, and which dried quickly, where wind patterns created microclimates, and how different plants thrived in different locations. Daiichi was learning the land in ways his father, focused only on immediate work, never had. While Hideaki fought against the land's natural tendencies, trying to impose his will through hard labor, Daiichi was learning to understand the land's own wisdom. One year, a severe drought struck the region. Hideaki worked harder than ever, carrying water to his crops, trying to save them through sheer effort. But most of his crops died anyway, as did the crops of other hard-working farmers. The drought was too severe for labor alone to overcome. But Daiichi, who everyone thought was lazy, quietly directed his efforts to the areas of the farm he knew, from his observations, retained moisture longest. He planted drought-resistant varieties in the driest areas. He used the natural wind patterns he had observed to create shade and reduce evaporation. He worked with the land's characteristics rather than against them. By the end of the season, Daiichi's sections of the farm had produced a modest but real harvest, while Hideaki's sections had produced almost nothing despite his exhausting efforts. Hideaki was stunned. "How did you do this? You barely worked compared to me." "I worked differently," Daiichi explained. "While you were laboring, I was learning. While you were fighting against the land, I was understanding it. My apparent laziness was actually observation. I was working, just not in ways that looked like work to you." He showed his father the subtle features of the land he had noticed, the slight depression that collected morning dew, the rock formation that created afternoon shade, the soil composition that retained moisture better than surrounding areas. "I learned all this by watching," Daiichi said, "by sitting still and paying attention rather than constantly moving and doing." Hideaki felt something shift in his understanding. He had been so focused on visible labor, on constant activity, on the appearance of hard work that he had never stopped to actually understand what he was working with. His son, whom he had judged as lazy, had been doing a different kind of work, the work of observation, understanding, and learning. "I'm sorry," Hideaki said. "I judged you without understanding what you were doing. I thought activity was the same as productivity, that visible effort was the same as effective effort. You were working all along, just in ways I didn't recognize as work." Word spread through the village about Daiichi's success during the drought. People who had judged him as lazy began to see him differently. Some felt ashamed of their premature conclusions. Others were curious about his methods. Daiichi began teaching other farmers what he had learned. He showed them how to read the land, how to observe rather than just labor, how to work with natural patterns rather than against them. The farmers who had once thought him lazy began to value his seemingly idle observation time. "I used to think you were wasting your life under those trees," one neighbor admitted. "Now I understand you were studying. You were learning in ways that look like laziness to people who don't understand what learning can be." A Zen monk who heard this story visited Daichi. "You've learned an important lesson that many people never learn," the monk said. "You've learned that judging too quickly, based on appearances and conventional standards, often misses the truth. Your father judged you by how much visible labor you performed, but the quality of your outcomes proved that visible labor isn't the only measure of value." Daichi nodded. "I learned something else too. I learned that what looks like laziness might be rest, or observation, or a different kind of work, and that what looks like hard work might be an inefficient struggle. Appearances are misleading, outcomes reveal truth." The monk smiled. "Your story reminds people not to judge too harshly or too quickly. The lazy son might be a careful observer. The apparently wasted time might be valuable learning. The story that seems simple at first viewing often has complexity that only reveals itself later." Years passed, and Daichi became known as a wise farmer, though he still spent time sitting under trees, watching the land. His father, who had once been ashamed of him, now proudly told people, "My son taught me that there are many kinds of work, and the work that looks least like work is sometimes the most valuable." Hideaki learned to balance his own labor with periods of observation. He became a better farmer by incorporating some of his son's apparent laziness, taking time to watch and understand rather than constantly acting. One day, a young person came to Daichi asking for advice. "My parents think I'm lazy because I spend time reading and thinking instead of working constantly. They say I'll never succeed. What should I do?" Daichi smiled. "Keep reading and thinking, but also find ways to apply what you learn. Let your outcomes speak for you, not your appearance in the industry. My father thought I was lazy until he saw what I produced. Your parents will understand when they see the fruits of your different kinds of work." He paused, then added, "But also understand their perspective. To someone who values visible labor, observation looks like idleness. To someone who measures worth by constant activity, stillness looks like laziness. Don't judge them for judging you. Just prove through outcomes that your way has value too." The young person asked, "But what if I fail? What if my approach doesn't produce results?" "Then you learn and adjust," Daichi replied. "I wasn't just sitting under trees doing nothing. I was observing, learning, thinking, and planning. If my approach had failed, I would have learned from that and tried something else." The point isn't that observation is always better than labor. The point is that judging approaches too quickly before seeing their outcomes often misses value. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider who you've been judging as lazy or unproductive. What if their stillness is observation? What if their rest is preparation? What if their apparent inactivity is actually a different kind of work that you don't recognize? And what about yourself? How harshly have you judged your own times of rest or stillness? Have you internalized the belief that only visible activity counts as work? Have you dismissed the value of observation, learning, thinking, and resting because these don't look like traditional labor? Not all work looks like work. Not all productivity is visible. Not all success comes from constant striving. Sometimes the lazy son who watches patiently sees what the hard-working father who never stops moving misses. Sometimes stillness achieves what activity cannot. Sometimes the full story only reveals itself long after the first judgment is made. Rest now without judging your rest. Let yourself be Daiichi under the tree, observing, learning, preparing in ways that might not look productive to outside observers, but that create real value. The lazy son wasn't lazy. He was doing a different kind of work. And so are you, even in this moment of apparent inactivity. Rest is work. Observation is productivity. Stillness is motion that hasn't revealed itself yet. Trust that the full story of your life will prove this, even if current appearances suggest otherwise. Sleep now, not lazy, but learning. Not inactive, but preparing. Not wasting time, but using it in ways that will only reveal their value when the drought comes, and your careful observation produces a harvest where frantic labor produced nothing. There was a master calligrapher named Yukiko who had devoted her entire life to the art of beautiful writing. For 60 years, she had practiced daily, creating works that were displayed in temples and palaces throughout the land. Her characters were considered the finest of her generation, but as she grew old, her hands began to shake. The tremor was slight at first, barely noticeable, but gradually it worsened, until she could no longer create the smooth flowing lines that had been her signature. The characters she wrote became jagged, uneven, broken by the involuntary movements of her aging hands. Yukiko was devastated. Calligraphy was not just her work, it was her identity, her life's purpose. She had defined herself through her art for 60 years. Now, unable to produce the quality of work she had maintained for decades, she felt her life was over. If she couldn't create beautiful calligraphy, what was she? She stopped taking commissions. She stopped teaching students. She sat in her studio, staring at blank paper, unable to bring herself to create imperfect work. Each day felt like waiting for death, as if her life had ended, even though her body continued. One day, a young calligrapher named Kenji came to visit her. He had studied her work and wanted to meet her before she died, as he had heard she was no longer creating. "Master Yukiko," he said, bowing deeply, "please, will you show me how you create such beautiful work?" "I can't," Yukiko replied bitterly. "My hands shake. I can no longer do what I once did. My time is over." "Show me anyway," Kenji persisted. "Show me what you do now, even if it's not what you once did." Reluctantly, to satisfy this persistent young man, Yukiko took up her brush. Her hand trembled as she moved it across the paper. The line broke and wavered. The character she was forming looked nothing like the smooth, perfect characters she had created for 60 years. But Kenji was staring at it with wonder. "This is extraordinary." "It's broken," Yukiko said. "It's everything I spent my life learning not to do." "It's alive," Kenji replied. "Your old work was perfect, but this has something your perfect work didn't have. It has a vulnerability. It has humanity. It shows the reality of the hand that made it, the tremor that comes with age, the imperfection that comes with being human. It's no less beautiful. It's beautiful in a different way." He pointed to specific places where the line broke. "See how this break creates a pause, a breath? See how this wobble adds energy, movement? You couldn't create these effects intentionally. They come from not being able to control everything, from allowing the reality of your condition to show." Yukiko looked at her shaky calligraphy with new eyes. She had been seeing only what it wasn't: smooth, controlled, perfect. She hadn't been seeing what it was: authentic, immediate, marked by the truth of her aging body. "You're saying my shaking hands aren't ending my art?" she asked. "They're changing it." "They're revealing a new possibility," Kenji said. "You've mastered perfection. You spent 60 years learning complete control. Now you're learning something else. How to create beauty without control. How to let your limitations become part of your art rather than obstacles to it. This isn't an ending. This is a beginning." Over the following months, Yukiko began to explore what Kenji had called a beginning. She stopped trying to fight against her tremor and started working with it. She let the shakiness show, let the broken lines be part of the aesthetic. Let her aging hands tell their own truth. The work she created was unlike anything she had done before. It had a raw quality, an honesty, a profound beauty that came from acceptance rather than mastery. People who saw it were moved in ways they couldn't quite explain. It touched something in them that perfect calligraphy never had. "Your new work feels more human," one viewer said. "The perfection was impressive, but this is relatable. This shows struggle and acceptance. This shows life as it actually is, not as we wish it to be." Other aging artists heard about Yukiko's transformation and came to see her. They too had been treating their declining abilities as endings, as tragedies that marked the end of their creative lives. Yukiko showed them something different. "What you call an ending is just a transition," she told a painter whose eyesight was failing. "You've lost what you had, yes, but loss creates space for something new. If you spend all your time mourning what's gone, you'll never discover what's trying to arrive." She showed them her shaky calligraphy. "These tremors would have horrified me 5 years ago. I would have hidden this work in shame. But I've learned that every ending contains a beginning. My hands' steady control had to end before I could begin learning to create beauty from their unsteady truth." A sculptor whose arthritis had made detailed work impossible asked, "But how do you accept the loss? How do you stop grieving what you can no longer do?" "I still grieve it sometimes," Yukiko admitted. "I still miss the feeling of complete control, the satisfaction of executing exactly what I envisioned. But I've discovered something. The part of me that created perfect calligraphy was actually quite limited. It could only create what I consciously intended. Now, with my shaking hands, I create things I never could have planned. The imperfection introduces an element beyond my control, and that element often produces more interesting results than my intentions ever did." She held up a piece of her new work. "See this character? I intended it to look one way. My tremor made it look another way. And the way it actually looks is more compelling than what I planned. The beginning I'm in now includes accident, chance, collaboration with my body's wisdom rather than domination of it." Kenji, who continued to visit Yukiko regularly, said, "You've become a better artist by becoming worse at control. Your mastery now includes accepting what you can't master. That's a higher skill than perfect technique ever was." Yukiko nodded. "When I had complete control, I could only create versions of what I already knew. Now, with partial control, I'm discovering things I didn't know were possible. The ending of my old art was the beginning of art I couldn't have created any other way. A Zen master who collected calligraphy commissioned a piece from Yukiko. When she delivered it, with all its shaky lines and broken strokes, he hung it in his meditation hall's place of honor. "This shows the essence of Zen," he told his students. "Perfection is static, fixed, dead. This work is dynamic, alive, accepting of change and impermanence." The master's tremor isn't a flaw in the work. It's the work teaching its deepest truth. That beauty includes imperfection. The endings contain beginnings. That loss creates space for discovery. Yukiko lived another 15 years, creating what many considered her finest work during this period. Critics called her late-style revolutionary, noting how it had influenced a generation of younger artists to embrace imperfection and vulnerability in their work. When she finally died at 85, still creating tremor-marked calligraphy to the end, her students gathered to remember her. They spoke of her two periods, the 60 years of perfect control and the 15 years of acknowledged tremor. "Which period was greater?" a young student asked. An older student replied, "She was always great." But she became wise only in her second period, when she learned that endings contain beginnings. When she discovered that what you lose forces you to find what you didn't know was there. When she understood that every door that closes reveals another door you weren't seeing before. Tonight, as you rest, what endings are you mourning? What losses are you treating as pure conclusions with nothing beyond them? What abilities, relationships, or circumstances have ended that you're grieving, as if ending means death rather than transition? Every ending contains a beginning you can't see yet. The closing of one possibility opens others that couldn't have opened if the first possibility had continued. Your losses aren't just subtractions. They're also additions of space, of new potential, of directions you couldn't have gone while the old way remained available. What's ending in you right now isn't your conclusion, it's your transition. Something is completing, so something else can begin. The tremor that seems to be ruining your perfect lines is actually creating new kinds of beauty you couldn't have achieved through control alone. Rest now in acceptance of endings as beginnings in disguise. What's leaving is making room. What's breaking is revealing. What's ending is beginning, just not in ways you can recognize yet. Trust the ending. It knows what it's doing. Every conclusion contains a hidden opening, and you're moving toward it even as you mourn what's closing behind you. Sleep now in the space between ending and beginning, knowing that this space itself is fertile ground where something unexpected and beautiful is already starting to grow. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. In a town famous for its craftsmen, there lived a clockmaker named Kenji who created timepieces of extraordinary precision. His clocks kept perfect time. His watches never gained or lost a second. People came from distant cities to purchase his work, and his reputation spread widely. But something happened to Kenji as his skill grew. He became obsessed with time in a way that began to consume his life. He would check his clocks constantly, comparing them against each other, anxious if any showed even the slightest deviation. He scheduled every moment of his day, allocating specific minutes to each task. He kept detailed records of how long everything took. analyzing his efficiency, trying to waste no time. His wife would call him for dinner, and he would arrive exactly at the scheduled moment, not a minute early or late. His children would ask him to play, and he would check his schedule, finding a 15-minute slot and setting a timer so he wouldn't run over. He measured everything, tracked everything, lived his entire life by the clock. People admired his discipline. "Kenji wastes no time," they would say. "He's so efficient, so organized." But his family felt differently. His wife felt like he was never really present, always watching the time, even during conversations. His children learned to stop asking him to play spontaneously, knowing he would need to check if that time was allocated. One day, Kenji's elderly father became very ill. Kenji visited him at the scheduled time each day, staying for exactly the planned duration. On what turned out to be his father's last day, Kenji was sitting beside the bed when his timer went off, indicating his visit slot was complete. "I have to go," Kenji said, standing up. "I have a client appointment in 20 minutes, and it takes 15 minutes to get there, so I need to leave now to be on time." His father looked at him with sad eyes. "Kenji, I may not be here tomorrow." "I know, father. I'll come back tomorrow at 2 p.m. as scheduled." His father died that evening, while Kenji was home eating dinner at precisely 6 p.m. as his schedule dictated. At the funeral, Kenji's father's friend, an old Zen monk named Joshu, approached him. "Your father loved you very much," Joshu said. "I know," Kenji replied. "I visited him every day." "Did you?" Joshu asked gently. "Or did you visit the time slot you had allocated for visiting?" Kenji felt something crack inside his chest. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. The monk was right. He had been there in body but not in presence. His mind had been on the clock, on the schedule, on the next appointment. He had measured out his love in timed portions, and now his father was gone, and all those precisely measured visits felt hollow. "I wasted it," Kenji whispered. "All that time I tracked so carefully, all that time I organized and measured, and I wasted the time that mattered." "You didn't waste it," Joshu said, "but you didn't fully live it either. You were so busy measuring time that you forgot to experience it." In his grief and shock, something shifted in Kenji. He went home and looked at all his clocks, all these devices he had spent years perfecting. They ticked away, measuring, dividing, tracking. And he realized they were measuring something that couldn't really be measured. A moment of real connection with his child had no measurable duration. The joy of a beautiful sunset didn't fit into scheduled slots. The depth of presence with another person couldn't be quantified in minutes and seconds. He had been living as if time were the most important thing, when actually what happened in time was what mattered. The next day, Kenji did something that shocked the town. He closed his clock shop. He put away his watches and timers. He stopped scheduling his days in measured blocks. His wife thought he had lost his mind. "What will we do? How will we live?" "We'll live," Kenji said simply. "Actually live. Not to measure our living. When I'm hungry, I'll eat. When I'm tired, I'll sleep. When our children want to play, I'll play. Not because it's scheduled, but because the moment calls for it." He still made clocks. It was his craft, his art, but he made them differently now. He would work on one until it felt complete. not until a timer said his work session was over. He would stop if he felt called to watch the sunset, or talk with a neighbor, or sit with his wife. He stopped trying to be efficient and started trying to be present. At first, this new way of living felt chaotic to him. Without schedules and timers, how would he know what to do? But gradually, he discovered a different kind of guidance. His body told him when to rest. His interest told him when to work. His relationships told him when a connection was needed. Life itself had a rhythm that didn't require clocks. His children noticed the change immediately. Their father would now play with them until the play naturally ended, not until a timer buzzed. He would listen to their stories without glancing at a watch. He was actually there, fully present, not counting the minutes until he could move to the next scheduled item. One evening, his daughter climbed into his lap and said, "Daddy, you're different now." "How so?" Kenji asked. "Before, you were here but not here. Now you're really here." Kenji felt tears in his eyes. "I'm learning," he said, "that being here is more important than being on time." Word spread about the clockmaker who had stopped caring about time. Some people thought he had gone mad. How could a clockmaker not care about time? But others were curious. They came to talk with him. "How do you live without schedules?" they asked. "How do you get everything done?" "I get done what needs to get done," Kenji replied. "But I've stopped confusing being busy with being productive. I've stopped measuring my worth by how efficiently I use time. Time isn't something to use or waste. It's what we live in. And I was so concerned with managing it that I forgot to inhabit it." He showed them the clocks he was making now. They were beautiful, functional, but somehow different. "These clocks can tell you what time it is," he explained, "but they can't tell you what to do with that time. They can measure duration, but not meaning. I made the mistake of letting the measurer become the master. The clock told me how to live, rather than serving my living." Joshu the monk visited Kenji's workshop months after the funeral. He watched Kenji work for a while, noticing the quality of attention the clockmaker brought to his craft, the way he would pause to watch light move across his workbench, the way he seemed fully engaged with what he was doing. "You've learned your father's final teaching," Joshu said. "What teaching?" "That life can't be saved up or stored or perfectly managed. It can only be lived moment by moment, with full presence or with partial presence. Your father's death reminded you that the time we have is uncertain, and that measuring it carefully doesn't make it last longer or mean more. Only living it fully does that." Kenji nodded. "I used to think I was honoring time by tracking it so carefully. But I was actually dishonoring it. I was treating time as an enemy to be managed rather than a gift to be received. I was so afraid of wasting time that I wasted life." Years later, people still bought Kenji's clocks, but they also came to him for a different kind of wisdom. They would ask, "How do I find more time?" And he would reply, "You can't find more time. You can only be more present to the time you have. Stop measuring and start experiencing. Stop tracking and start living." The clock is useful for coordination, for knowing when to meet others, and for practical matters. But it's a terrible master. Don't let it tell you that measured time is more valuable than experienced time. Tonight, as you rest, notice if you're measuring. Are you tracking how long it takes you to fall asleep? Are you calculating how many hours of rest you'll get? Are you monitoring your progress toward relaxation? What if you stopped measuring and started experiencing? What if this moment of rest didn't need to be timed or tracked or evaluated? What if you could simply be here, in this unmeasured moment, present to breath and sensation without any concern for duration? Your life is not a clock to be wound and measured. It's an experience to be lived and felt. Tonight, forget time. Let yourself drift into timelessness, where there's no past to regret and no future to plan for. Just this eternal now that needs no measurement because it simply is. Rest in the unmeasured moment. That's where real life happens. Not in the counted minutes, but in the presence that fills them. There was a calligrapher named Setsuko who took great pride in her work. She would spend hours creating each character, each stroke perfect, each piece a work of art that she expected would last for generations. One day, she acquired a special ink that a merchant had brought from a distant province. The ink created beautiful deep blacks and flowed perfectly from her brush. But she soon discovered it had an unusual property. It never fully dried. Even days after she had finished a piece, the ink remained slightly wet. If you touched it, even carefully, it would smudge. At first, Setsuko was furious. She couldn't sell work that would smudge. She couldn't give pieces as gifts, knowing they would be ruined by the first careless touch. All her effort was going into work that couldn't be preserved. She tried everything to make the ink dry properly, but nothing worked. Finally, in frustration, she went to the merchant who had sold it to her, demanding her money back. The merchant looked surprised. But that's the nature of this ink. I told you it was special. Special? It's defective. It won't dry. Exactly, the merchant said. It's teaching ink. It reminds you that nothing you create is permanent. Your beautiful calligraphy will eventually fade, whether from age or damage or fire. This ink just makes the impermanence more obvious. Setsuko went home angry, but she couldn't stop thinking about the merchant's words. Everything she created would eventually be destroyed. The ink that wouldn't dry was just being honest about what was true of all her work. She began to approach her calligraphy differently. Instead of creating pieces meant to last forever, she started creating pieces meant for the moment. She would write on large papers and hang them in her studio, knowing they would slowly smudge and blur over time. She found this liberating. Each piece was perfect for now, and its eventual deterioration was part of its nature, not a tragedy. She began inviting people to come and breathe near her work, to let their breath slowly alter the still wet ink. The pieces became collaborations with time and circumstance, always changing, never fixed. I was trying to create permanent beauty, she told a student, but permanence doesn't exist. Everything changes. This ink taught me to make peace with that, to create beauty that's beautiful right now, without needing it to last forever. Tonight, what are you trying to make permanent that was always meant to change? What are you clinging to as if you could freeze it in time? Everything you love, everything you create, everything you are, it's all like ink that won't quite dry. Always shifting, always changing, always vulnerable to smudging. This isn't a tragedy. It's just the nature of existence. Let go of needing things to be permanent. Enjoy them while they're here. Create them knowing they'll change. Love them knowing they'll pass. The impermanence isn't the problem. Your fight against impermanence is. Rest now in the acceptance that nothing lasts forever, and that's what makes this moment precious. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In an ancient temple, there lived a cat named Tama, who seemed to do nothing but sleep in the sun. While monks meditated, Tama napped. While monks worked, Tama lounged. While monks studied, Tama groomed herself lazily. To visitors, the cat appeared to be a freeloader, enjoying the temple's hospitality while contributing nothing. A new abbot arrived at the temple, a young man named Ryokan, who believed in efficiency and purpose. He was troubled by the cat's apparent uselessness. "That cat does nothing," he complained to the senior monks. "She just sleeps and eats. Why do we keep her?" The senior monks smiled but said nothing. They had learned long ago that Tama's purpose wasn't obvious to everyone immediately. Ryokan decided the cat had to earn her keep. He began assigning her duties: chase mice in the storage rooms, patrol the gardens for pests, anything productive. But Tama ignored these assignments. She continued her routine of sleeping in sunny spots, occasionally stretching, maintaining her serene presence. Frustrated, Ryokan announced his intention to find the cat a new home. "We cannot justify feeding an animal that serves no purpose." That very night, as if to prove his point, mice invaded the temple's grain storage. Ryokan rushed to wake the cat, to put her to work catching these pests. But he couldn't find her. She wasn't in any of her usual sleeping spots. Then he heard it. A soft, steady purring coming from the storage room. He opened the door and found Tama sitting perfectly still in the center of the room. She wasn't chasing mice. She wasn't even moving. She was just sitting, present, alert, purring quietly. And there were no mice in the room. Ryokan could hear them in the walls, could hear them trying to enter, but none crossed the threshold where Tama sat. Her mere presence, her calm watchfulness, was keeping them at bay. She didn't need to chase them. She didn't need to kill them. She just needed to be there. Ryokan watched for over an hour. Tama never moved, never broke her meditation. She was like a guardian statue, her presence creating a boundary that mice instinctively wouldn't cross. Finally, as dawn approached, she stood, stretched, and calmly walked out of the storage room, heading for her favorite sunny spot. The senior monks found Ryokan standing in wonder. "She does have a purpose," he said quietly. "Yes," one of the senior monks replied, "but not the purpose you imagined. You wanted her to chase and hunt. You wanted visible action, measurable productivity. But Tama's gift is presence. She protects through being, not through doing. The mice sense a predator and stay away. She doesn't have to work hard. She just has to be what she is." Another monk added, "We tried to train cats before Tama. Cats that were energetic hunters, always chasing, always catching. But they disturbed the temple's peace. They left dead mice everywhere. They were exhausting to live with. Tama protects quietly, peacefully, just by being present. Her seeming laziness is actually perfect efficiency." Ryokan bowed to the cat, who had settled into a patch of morning sun and was already falling asleep. "Forgive me, Tama. I judged your worth by my standards instead of understanding your actual purpose. From that day forward, Ryokan looked at everything in the temple differently. The old plum tree that no longer bore fruit, he had planned to cut down. But the monks showed him how its branches were perfect for birds to nest in, how its shade cooled the meditation hall on summer days, how its twisted trunk was beautiful in a way that useful, productive trees never were. Its purpose wasn't production, its purpose was beauty and shelter. The ancient bell that was cracked and no longer rang clearly, he wanted to replace. But the monks explained that its imperfect tone was beloved, that its crack created a unique sound found nowhere else, and that generations of monks had learned to meditate to this particular tone. Its flaw was actually its distinction. The novice monk who seemed slow at learning, whom Ryokan had considered asking to leave, turned out to be extraordinarily patient with visitors, able to sit with grieving people for hours without becoming uncomfortable. His slowness at intellectual tasks was balanced by his gift for compassionate presence. "I've been judging everything by a narrow standard," Ryokan confessed to the senior monks. "Productivity, efficiency, obvious usefulness, but the temple isn't a business, it's an ecosystem. Everything has its place, its purpose, even if that purpose isn't immediately obvious or doesn't fit conventional measures of value." He spent hours watching Tama, learning from her. She seemed to do nothing, yet her presence maintained order. She appeared lazy, yet she was perfectly alert when needed. She looked like a burden, yet she contributed essential value. She taught that being can be as important as doing, that presence can accomplish what action cannot, that some purposes are served by appearing purposeless. One day, a wealthy donor visited the temple and was offended to see a cat sleeping on expensive cushions in the main hall. "Why do you allow this animal such privilege? She produces nothing." Ryokan smiled and told the story of Tama and the mice. "She produces protection through presence. She contributes peace through her serene being. Her value can't be measured in conventional terms, but it's real and essential. She teaches us that purpose isn't always about production or visible action. Sometimes purpose is about simply being what you are, fully and completely in the right place." The donor looked skeptical, so Ryokan continued. "You're a wealthy merchant. You measure value in terms of production, profit, and tangible results, but not everything valuable can be measured that way. How do you measure the worth of beauty, of peace, of a presence that prevents problems rather than solving them? Tama's purpose is subtle but essential. Without her, we would have chaos. With her, we have order. That she achieves this through napping rather than through frantic activity doesn't diminish her contribution." Years passed, and eventually Tama grew old and died. The monks gave her a funeral with full honors, acknowledging her years of service. They tried to find another cat to serve her function, but none could quite match her particular gift. Some cats were too aggressive, chasing everything and disturbing the peace. Others were too passive, failing to maintain the protective presence that Tama had embodied. Finally, they found a cat with Tama's quality, a calm, serene presence that protected through being rather than doing. This cat they named Tama II, and she took up residence in the sunny spots her predecessor had loved, continuing the tradition of purposeful purposelessness. Ryokan, now an old man himself, would often sit with the new Tama and remember the lessons the original had taught him. Every being has its place in the whole, he would tell young monks, but that place might not look like what we expect. Purpose isn't always about obvious productivity. Sometimes it's about being present, being yourself, contributing in ways that aren't measurable but are nonetheless essential. He would point to the sleeping cat. Tama teaches us not to judge too quickly, not to assess worth by narrow standards, not to dismiss what we don't immediately understand. She teaches us that the temple, like all of life, is an ecosystem where even the apparently useless serves a purpose, where presence matters as much as action, where being is as valuable as doing. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own purpose. Perhaps you've been judging yourself by standards that don't fit what you actually are. Perhaps you've been trying to be productive in ways that go against your nature. Perhaps you've been dismissing your own value because it doesn't fit conventional measures. What if your purpose, like Tama's, is partly about presence, about being what you are, where you are, contributing value that isn't always visible or measurable? What if your times of rest, of apparent inactivity, of just being present, are actually serving important purposes that busy productivity never could? You don't have to chase and hunt and constantly produce to have worth. Sometimes protection comes through peaceful presence. Sometimes order is maintained through calm being. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is rest completely, be present fully, and trust that your very existence contributes to the whole in ways you may never fully understand. Sleep now like Tama, knowing that even in sleeping, you serve a purpose. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. Villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right. That what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand. That what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards, and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. "My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction?" "Tell me about your son," Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. "It's backwards," she insisted. "Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature." "Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing," Fumiko suggested gently. "Is he talented musically?" "Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty." "Doesn't it?" Fumiko asked. "The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong. She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance." She pointed to the river. "This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwoods river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. In a garden temple, the monks kept a beautiful crane named Haku in a large bamboo enclosure. Haku had been brought to the temple as an injured chick, nursed back to health, and raised in the enclosure where he was safe from predators and provided with ample food. For 3 years, Haku lived comfortably in his bamboo home. The monks fed him daily, cleaned his space, and even spoke to him in gentle tones. He had everything a crane could need except freedom, though the monks assured themselves they were keeping him safe. One day, a traveling priest named Osho visited the temple and saw Haku in his enclosure. The priest noticed that Haku's wings had grown strong and full. He was clearly capable of flight, yet he never attempted to fly beyond the bamboo walls, even though portions of the enclosure were open to the sky. "Why doesn't your crane fly away?" Osho asked the monks. "He could if he wanted to," one monk replied. "We don't clip his wings." But he stays because he knows this is where his food comes, where he's safe, where he belongs. Osho watched Haku for several days. The crane would walk around his enclosure, occasionally stretching his wings, but never attempting actual flight. It was as if Haku had forgotten that flight was even possible, that his wings had any purpose beyond stretching. On his last day at the temple, Osho asked permission to enter Haku's enclosure. He approached the crane slowly, then suddenly clapped his hands and shouted, startling Haku into the air. The crane's wings opened instinctively, and for a moment, Haku was flying, truly flying, circling above the enclosure in surprise. But after only 2 circles, Haku landed back in his familiar corner, as if the brief flight had frightened rather than thrilled him. He settled back into his routine immediately, walking the same worn paths he always walked. The monks were angry. "You scared him! You could have hurt him!" "I showed him he could fly," Osho replied calmly, "but he chose to land. That choice tells me something important. Your crane is imprisoned not by bamboo walls, but by comfort. He could leave any time, but he won't, because the enclosure has become more familiar than freedom." He looked at the monks gathered around him. And before you judge Haku too harshly, ask yourselves, how are you different? How many of you are living in comfortable enclosures of your own making, never attempting to fly because the familiar is safer than the possible? One young monk, named Botan, was particularly struck by this question. He realized he had been at the temple for 5 years, had taken preliminary vows, but had never fully committed to the monastic life. He was comfortable in this in-between state, receiving the structure and security of monastery life without the full commitment it demanded. Like Haku, he had wings he never used. After Osho left, Botan couldn't stop thinking about the crane. He began to see Haku differently, not as a bird being kept safe, but as a bird being kept comfortable in a cage he could leave any time. And he began to see himself the same way. He started paying attention to all the ways the monastery had become his comfortable enclosure. He knew when every meal would come. He knew exactly what each day would bring. He had routines that felt safe, relationships that felt predictable, a life that felt controlled. And he realized this comfort was preventing him from attempting the flight that monastic life was actually meant to enable. The leap into full commitment, into genuine spiritual practice, into the risk and uncertainty that real transformation requires. "I've been living like Haku," Botan confessed to the abbot. "Safe and comfortable, but not really alive. Not really practicing, just walking the same familiar paths day after day." The abbot, who'd been troubled by Osho's words about the crane, nodded. "You're not alone." Many of us have made the monastery into a comfortable cage rather than a launching place. We've mistaken security for wisdom, routine for practice, comfort for peace. He gestured toward Haku's enclosure. The priest was right to startle the crane into flight, not to frighten him, but to remind him what his wings were for. Perhaps we all need to be startled sometimes, reminded that we have wings we're not using, capabilities we're not exercising, flights we're not attempting, because the ground feels safer. The monks began to look at their own lives with new eyes. They noticed patterns of comfortable avoidance, ways they stayed safely within self-imposed limits, flights they could attempt but didn't. The monastery, meant to be a place of transformation, had become for many a place of comfortable stagnation. Gradually, changes began to happen. Monks who had been avoiding difficult practices began to attempt them. Commitments that had been postponed were made. Risks that had seemed too frightening were taken. Not everyone changed. Some preferred the comfortable enclosure, but many discovered they had wings they had forgotten about. As for Haku, the monks began to encourage him to fly, taking him to open areas and gently startling him into the air. At first, he would fly only briefly before landing back in familiar territory. But eventually, his flights grew longer. One day, Haku flew beyond the temple grounds entirely and didn't return. The monks felt both loss and joy. They had loved having Haku, but they recognized that keeping him comfortable had been keeping him caged. Setting him free, truly free, not just free within limits, was the compassionate thing, even though it meant losing him. Botan, watching Haku disappear into the distance, felt inspired. If a crane can remember how to fly after 3 years of comfortable captivity, then surely I can remember what I came here to do. I've been in my bamboo enclosure long enough. He took his final vows that week, fully committing to monastic life. It was terrifying in a way his comfortable half-commitment had never been. But it was also exhilarating, like stretching wings he had forgotten he possessed. Years later, when Botan had become a teacher, he would often tell the story of Haku the crane. "We all build comfortable enclosures," he would say. "Relationships that feel safe but limit growth. Jobs that provide security but prevent exploration. Routines that feel comforting but cage us. The bamboo walls look like protection, but they're actually prevention, preventing us from discovering what we're capable of, from attempting flights we were made for." Students would ask, But how do we know when comfort has become a cage? When should we leave the enclosure? When you're walking the same paths day after day without growth, Botan would reply. When you've stopped even looking at the sky. When you've forgotten you have wings. When the thought of flying fills you with fear rather than excitement. These are signs that comfort has become captivity, that the safe enclosure has become a prison you don't recognize as a prison because it's comfortable. He would pause, then add, "The tragedy isn't being in the enclosure. The tragedy is forgetting you can leave, forgetting you were made for flight, forgetting that your wings have purpose beyond stretching." Haku lived 3 years in comfortable captivity before someone reminded him he could fly. How many years will you live in yours before you remember? Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own bamboo enclosure. What comfortable cage have you built for yourself? What safe patterns have you established that prevent growth? What flights are you not attempting because staying grounded feels safer? You have wings. You've always had wings. The question isn't whether you're capable of flight. You are. The question is whether you've become so comfortable with the ground that you've forgotten that the sky is where you belong. Whether the bamboo enclosure feels so safe that you've stopped noticing it's still an enclosure. Rest tonight with this awareness. Tomorrow, you could fly. You could attempt something that terrifies you. You could leave the comfortable patterns and risk the unknown. You could stretch your wings, not just as exercise, but as preparation for actual flight. The cage isn't locked. It never was. You've just been comfortable enough that you forgot to try the door. Sleep now and dream of flying. Let some part of you remember what your wings are for. And when you wake, maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready to find out what happens when you actually use them. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. At the edge of a village stood a house whose small garden received almost no direct sunlight. Tall buildings on either side cast shadows that leave the garden in shade for all but an hour each day. The previous owners had tried repeatedly to grow sun-loving flowers and vegetables, but everything either died or grew weak and spindly, stretching desperately toward the brief sliver of light. When Yuki moved into the house, neighbors warned her about the garden. "Nothing grows there," they said. "The shade is too deep. Better to pave it over and use it for storage." But Yuki looked at the shaded space differently. "It's not that nothing can grow here," she said. "It's that sun-loving plants can't grow here. The garden isn't bad. It's just suited for different things than the previous owners were trying to grow." She began researching plants that thrived in shade, ferns that loved the dim moisture, hostas with broad leaves that caught what little light appeared, shade-loving flowers that bloomed in muted colors, but with delicate beauty. Instead of fighting the garden's nature, she worked with it. Within a year, Yuki's shaded garden was lush and beautiful. It didn't look like sunny gardens with their bright flowers and robust vegetables. It had a different aesthetic, subtle, cool, mysterious. The greens were deeper, the flowers were more delicate. The whole space had a quality of quiet richness that sun-blasted gardens never achieved. Neighbors who had declared the space hopeless came to see what Yuki had created. They were amazed, though some were still dismissive. "It's pretty," one neighbor said, "but it's not a real garden." Real gardens have tomatoes and sunflowers and bright colors. Your garden is just making the best of bad conditions. "Are it conditions bad?" Yuki asked. "Or just different conditions?" "These ferns and hostas are barely surviving. They're thriving. They're doing exactly what they evolved to do in exactly the kind of environment they need. The previous owners failed because they tried to grow sun plants in shade. I'm succeeding because I'm growing shade plants in shade." She touched a particularly lush fern. "This plant would die in full sun. It needs shade. For this fern, my garden isn't difficult conditions, it's ideal conditions. The mistake is measuring all gardens by sun garden standards and calling everything else deficient." A young woman named Hannah, who lived nearby, was struck by this perspective. Hannah had always felt like she was growing in the shade in difficult circumstances that made the kind of success others achieved impossible for her. She had health issues that limited her energy. She lived in poverty, which restricted her opportunities. She lacked the family support that others took for granted. Everyone told her she needed to overcome these limitations, to find more light, to transform her difficult conditions into easier ones. But what if, like Yuki's garden, she just needed to stop trying to grow like a sun plant and instead discover how to thrive as a shade plant? She came to talk with Yuki about this idea. "I feel like I'm always failing," Hana admitted, "because I can't achieve what healthy, wealthy people with family support achieve. I'm trying to grow tomatoes in shade, basically. But I don't know what the equivalent of shade plants would be for a human life." Yuki walked her through the garden, explaining her choices. "See how I chose plants that need less energy? That's like you choosing work that fits your energy levels rather than jobs that demand more than you can give. See how I selected plants that thrive in cool, moist conditions? That's like you finding strengths that develop specifically because of your limitations, not despite them." She pointed to a particularly beautiful shade flower. "This would never survive in full sun. Its delicate petals would burn. But here, protected from harsh light, it blooms with a beauty that sun lovers can't achieve." Your limitations might protect you from certain kinds of harm while allowing you to develop qualities that people in easier conditions never develop. Hana began to reconsider her entire life. What if she stopped measuring herself by sun garden standards? What if she found shade garden ways to thrive? She had deep empathy, probably developed through her own suffering. She had patience, learned through chronic illness. She had creativity in making do with little, born from poverty. These weren't consolation prizes for failing at normal success. These were actual strengths, shade plant qualities that were valuable in themselves. She started making different choices. She took a job that paid less, but required less energy, allowing her to work sustainably rather than constantly burning out. She developed friendships with others who lived in shade, creating community with people who understood difficult circumstances. She stopped apologizing for needing things that others didn't need, recognizing that shade plants legitimately need different care than sun plants. Word spread about Yuki's garden and the perspective it represented. People who felt they were growing in difficult conditions began to see themselves differently. A man with learning disabilities stopped trying to compete in academic environments and found work that used his practical intelligence. a woman with anxiety stopped forcing herself into high-stress social situations and built a life that honored her need for quiet. A family with limited income stopped feeling inadequate for not achieving wealth and found richness in their strong relationships. The Shade Garden teaching, as people began to call it, spread beyond individuals to organizations. A school started creating Shade Garden programs for students who couldn't thrive in standard classroom environments. A business developed positions specifically designed for people with limitations that made traditional jobs difficult. A community center created spaces for people who needed accommodations that mainstream spaces didn't provide. Not everyone appreciated this perspective. Some critics said it encouraged people to accept limitations rather than overcoming them. You're telling people to give up, they argued, to accept that they can't thrive in normal conditions rather than working to change their circumstances. Yuki would answer these critics by walking them through her garden. Look at these plants. Should they be working to become sun plants? Should they be trying to overcome their shade-thriving nature? Or should they be celebrated for being excellent at what they actually are? She would point to a struggling plant that needed more light. Sometimes you do need to change conditions. This plant is genuinely in the wrong place. It needs to be moved to a more light-filled place. But most of these plants, they're exactly where they should be, thriving in conditions that sun plants would call impossible. The question isn't whether to overcome all limitations. The question is whether your limitations are like shade for a shade plant, the right conditions for your actual nature, or like shade for a sun plant, wrong conditions that need to change. A teacher named Nobuo applied this to his classroom. He stopped trying to make all students thrive in the same way. He recognized that some students were sun plants who needed bright, fast-paced, competitive environments. Others were shade plants that needed quiet, slow, supportive conditions. Trying to make shade plant students compete in sun plant ways was as futile as trying to grow ferns in full sun. He created different pathways through his curriculum, different ways to demonstrate learning, and different environments within his classroom. And he found that students he had previously considered struggling were actually thriving. They just needed shade garden conditions to show what they could do. Years later, Yuki's garden became something of a pilgrimage site for people living in difficult circumstances. They would come to see that lushness was possible even in shade, that beauty didn't require ideal conditions, that thriving could look different from what sunny gardens showed. Yuki, now elderly, would sit in her garden talking with visitors. The hardest thing, she would tell them, is stopping comparing yourself to sun gardens. Stop measuring your lushness by their standards. Stop trying to be bright when your beauty is subtle. Once you accept that you're a shade garden, once you stop apologizing for it and start working with it, you discover possibilities you never knew existed. She would touch the ferns and hostas she had planted decades earlier, now mature and magnificent. These plants are barely surviving in bad conditions. They're thriving in ideal conditions for their nature. The shade isn't their obstacle, it's their element. And the same might be true for you. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider the shade you're growing in. The difficult conditions you've been taught to see as obstacles might actually be the right environment for who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who sun gardens demand, but who you actually are. Stop trying to grow sun plants in shade. Stop measuring yourself by standards designed for different conditions. Start asking, what does thriving look like for a shade plant? What can I grow that loves these exact conditions? What beauty can emerge specifically because of these limitations, not despite them? Rest now in your shade garden. Let yourself be a fern, a hosta, a delicate shade flower. Stop burning yourself trying to bloom in full sun. Sink into the cool moisture of your actual conditions and discover what wants to grow there. Shade isn't a deficiency. It's just a different light. And different light creates different beauty. Trust that yours is worth growing. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. I'm perfecting it, Kaori protested. No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail. She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. How do I know when something is done? Kaori asked quietly. How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up? You feel it, Etsuko replied. True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment. She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio, being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. I've been hiding, Kaori admitted, calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance. With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect, Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better, they just delayed it. Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear, Kaori said. When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead. She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal. In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing, she told students. Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference, and then, when it's time, let go. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a coastal city, there lived a renowned mapmaker named Genji, who had charted more territory than any cartographer of his generation. His maps were detailed, accurate, and highly sought after by merchants, explorers, and military leaders. Every island, every coastline, every mountain range he documented was rendered with precision. But Genji had a practice that other mapmakers mocked. Whenever his knowledge ended, whenever he reached the limits of what had been explored and documented, he would leave the map blank. Large white spaces appeared on his charts, marked only with the words "unknown territory," or sometimes just left empty. Other mapmakers found this approach unprofessional. They would fill in the blank spaces with speculation, with reports from unreliable sources, with educated guesses. A map should be complete, they would argue. Blank spaces make it look unfinished. Blank spaces are honest, Genji would reply. They tell the truth, that we don't know what's there. Filling them with guesses tells a lie that we do know. But the criticism stung, especially when clients would choose other mapmakers' complete maps over Genji's honest but incomplete ones. People wanted certainty, even false certainty. They wanted maps that told them what lay everywhere, even if those maps were partly fiction. One season, a wealthy merchant named Ichiro commissioned Genji to create a map for a trading expedition to distant islands. When Genji delivered the map, Ichiro was dismayed by the large blank areas. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Ichiro complained. "I need to know what's in these blank spaces. I need to plan my route." "What's in those spaces is unknown," Genji replied. "No reliable expedition has charted them. I can't tell you what I don't know." "But other mapmakers have filled in these areas," Ichiro protested. "They show islands, harbors, channels." "Based on speculation," Genji said. "Based on second-hand rumors and wishful thinking. If you sail using those maps, you'll be navigating by fantasy. My blank spaces at least tell you where certainty ends." Ichiro hired a different map maker who provided a complete map with no blank spaces. The expedition set sail using this fully detailed chart, confident in their route. 3 months later, the expedition returned, having lost 2 ships. They had found islands where the map showed open ocean, encountered reefs where the map showed safe passage, and wasted weeks exploring channels that didn't exist. The complete map had been worse than useless. It had been dangerous. Ichiro returned to Genji, chastened. "Your blank spaces would have saved lives. If I had known we were entering unknown territory, I would have proceeded cautiously. Instead, I trusted a map that pretended to know, and that false certainty led to disaster." "Blank spaces scare people," Genji acknowledged. "They remind us how much we don't know, how limited our understanding is. But pretending we know more than we do is worse than admitting our ignorance. The blank space says, 'Be careful here. Proceed thoughtfully. Don't assume.' The falsely filled space says, 'It's safe to trust this,' which is a dangerous lie." Word spread about Ichiro's disaster and Genji's honest maps. More clients began to value the blank spaces, recognizing them as marks of integrity rather than incompleteness. They learned to read Genji's maps differently. The detailed areas showed where knowledge was reliable. The blank areas showed where caution was needed. A young apprentice named Lin came to study with Genji. She had been trained by other map makers who filled in all spaces, and she struggled with Genji's insistence on leaving blanks. "But we can make educated guesses," Lin argued. "We know the general geography of the region. We can estimate where islands are likely to be." "And we'd be wrong half the time," Genji replied. "An educated guess isn't knowledge. It's speculation with a fancy name. If you mark speculation as if it's fact, you're lying to whoever uses your map." He spread out several maps on his table, his own with its blank spaces, and competitors' maps of the same regions with every space filled. These complete maps look more professional, more finished. But which is more honest? Which better serves someone trusting their life to the information? Lin began to understand, but still she resisted. People don't want to be told we don't know. They want answers, even imperfect ones. Then they want comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths, Genji said. And it's not our job to provide comforting lies. Our job is to chart what's known and clearly mark what's not. The blank space is information. It tells you something important. Here be dragons, or at least here be unknowns. Proceed carefully. Over time, Lynn learned to value the blank spaces. She discovered that leaving areas blank required as much skill as filling them in. You had to know exactly where certainty ended, had to resist the temptation to extend your knowledge beyond its actual limits, and had to be comfortable with admitting you didn't have all the answers. One day, an explorer returned from a region Genji had left blank on his maps. The explorer had detailed charts of what was actually there. Your blank space wasn't really blank, the explorer said, showing Genji islands and coastlines that had been unknown before. Now it's not blank, Genji agreed, carefully adding the new information to his map. But it was blank until you explored it. That's how honest maps work. They grow as knowledge grows, but they never pretend to knowledge we don't have. He looked at the transformed map. See how the blank space has been replaced with detail. That's how it should happen. First honest acknowledgement of ignorance, then actual exploration, then knowledge replacing the unknown. But some map makers skip the first step and go straight to filling in spaces with imagination, which prevents anyone from recognizing what actually needs to be explored. Years later, Genji's blank spaces became the very thing that made his maps valuable. Explorers would deliberately seek out the blank spaces on Genji's maps, knowing these marked genuinely unexplored territory rather than cartographic guesswork. Military leaders trusted Genji's maps precisely because they showed where trust should end. A historian interviewing Genji late in his life asked, "Don't the blank spaces bother you? Don't you wish you could fill in all the unknown areas before you die?" "No," Genji replied without hesitation. "The blank spaces are the most honest things on my maps. They say, 'I don't know,' which is often the truest thing a person can say. I could fill them with speculation and fantasy, making maps that look complete. But I'd rather make true maps." He gestured to his life's work, hundreds of maps, all marked with careful detail where knowledge existed and honest blankness where it didn't. These blank spaces are my legacy. They're me admitting the limits of my knowledge, refusing to pretend omniscience, valuing truth over completeness. Every map maker who fills in the unknown with guesses is choosing ego over integrity. I choose integrity. The historian looked at a particularly large blank space on one map. Will this ever be filled in? Perhaps, Genji said. Perhaps someone will explore that region and bring back reliable information, or perhaps it will remain blank forever. Either way, my map is honest right now, which is all any map can be. The map maker who fills in that space with speculation is making a map that's dishonest right now, in the hope that by accident he might be correct later. That's not map making. That's gambling. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the blank spaces in your own understanding. Where are you filling in unknowns with speculation, pretending certainty you don't have, telling yourself and others you know things you actually don't? What would it mean to leave those spaces blank, to honestly mark them as unknown? The blank space isn't a failure. It's honesty. It's saying, "I don't know," instead of offering false certainty. It's admitting the limits of your understanding rather than pretending those limits don't exist. This feels vulnerable because we're taught that certainty is strength and uncertainty is weakness. But actually, false certainty is weakness disguised as strength, while honest uncertainty is strength willing to show itself. Rest now in your blank spaces. Let yourself not know what you don't know. Let yourself mark large areas of your life, your future, your understanding as unknown territory. This isn't an admission of failure, it's commitment to truth. The mapmaker with blank spaces serves better than the one with false completeness. So do you. Your honest "I don't know" is more valuable than anyone's false "I'm certain." Sleep in the blank spaces tonight where truth lives. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins in a town known for its elaborate storytelling tradition. There arrived a performer who couldn't speak. Her name was Yuki, and she had lost her voice to an illness years before. Despite this, she claimed to be a storyteller, which puzzled the townspeople. How could someone without a voice tell stories? The town's master storyteller, a man named Jiro, who was famous for his eloquent speech and powerful voice, was particularly skeptical. "Storytelling is about words," he said dismissively. "Without words, you have nothing. You're not a storyteller, you're just a mime." But the town's curiosity was strong enough that they allowed Yuki to perform one evening in the town square. Jiro attended, expecting to prove his point about the necessity of words. Yuki stepped onto the platform, wearing simple clothes, carrying no props. She stood in silence for a long moment, then began to move. Her movements were subtle at first, just small shifts in posture, gentle expressions crossing her face. But gradually, through gesture, expression, and presence, a story began to emerge. Without a single word, she conveyed a tale of loss and discovery. Her body became a person grieving, and everyone watching felt the grief. Her face showed the journey from despair to hope, and the audience traveled that journey with her. Her hands painted images in the air that everyone could see, even though nothing visible was there. The story lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it ended, Yuki simply bowed and left the platform. The audience sat in stunned silence, many with tears running down their faces. Jiro, the master storyteller, was shaken. He had told thousands of stories in his career, using all his skill with words, all his vocal techniques. But he had never moved an audience the way Yuki just had, without saying anything at all. He approached her later. "I don't understand. How did you do that? Without words, how did you communicate so much?" Yuki took out a small board she used for writing and wrote, "Words point to truth, but words are not truth itself. I cannot use words, so I must speak the truth directly. My presence must communicate what my voice cannot." Jiro read this and sat down heavily. "I've spent my whole life mastering words. And you just showed me that words might be the least important part of storytelling." Yuki wrote again, "Words are useful, but presence is essential. You can have perfect words with no presence, and people feel nothing. You can have no words but complete presence, and people feel everything. I didn't choose to lose my voice, but losing it taught me that what I thought was essential actually wasn't." Over the following days, Jiro spent time with Yuki, learning her way of storytelling. She showed him how much could be communicated through posture, through the quality of attention, through authentic presence. She demonstrated that silence could say more than speech, that stillness could convey more than elaborate gestures. When you use words, she wrote, you risk people hearing the words but missing the truth behind them. They get caught in analyzing what you said, agreeing or disagreeing with your choice of words. But when you communicate through presence, there are no words to argue with. People feel the truth directly. Jiro began incorporating this into his own storytelling. He still used words, but he paid more attention to presence, to silence, to the communication that happened beyond language. His storytelling deepened, became more powerful. People said something had changed, though they couldn't quite name what. One day, a young person who couldn't speak came to the town, devastated by the belief that they could never communicate effectively. Jiro brought them to meet Yuki. You think your inability to speak is a limitation, he told the young person, but this woman has shown me it's also an opportunity. An opportunity to develop forms of communication that go deeper than words, to learn to be so present that your mere being conveys what others need elaborate sentences to express. Yuki performed for the young person and afterward wrote, I grieved my lost voice for years. I thought I had lost the essential tool for human connection, but I was wrong. Presence is the essential tool. Voice is just one way among many to express presence. You haven't lost the ability to communicate. You've been allowed to master a form of communication that speaking people often neglect. Tonight, let yourself communicate without words. Let your presence speak. In the silence of rest, convey to yourself and to the universe whatever needs to be said, without saying anything at all. Words are useful, but they're not essential. Presence is essential, and your presence right now, silent and still, communicates everything that needs to be communicated. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to explain or describe or articulate. Just be here, fully present, and let that presence be the story that's being told tonight. In a mountain monastery lived an old abbess named Ren, who kept in her private chamber an unusual mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface darkened and worn until it reflected almost nothing. Visitors who saw it would often remark on its uselessness. Your mirror shows nothing, they would say. Why keep it? Get a new one that actually works. But Ren treasured this mirror and looked into it every morning. It shows me exactly what I need to see, she would reply, though she never explained what she meant. One day, a vain young woman named Ayame came to the monastery seeking spiritual guidance. She was beautiful and knew it, spending hours each day on her appearance, constantly checking her reflection in every available surface. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her looks. During her first meeting with Ren, Ayame couldn't stop glancing at the darkened mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of herself. But the mirror showed nothing, just a dark, murky surface with barely a hint of reflection. Your mirror is broken, Ayame said with annoyance. Don't you want to see yourself? I see myself perfectly well in this mirror, Ren replied. What do you see? Nothing. It's too dark. Exactly, Ren said, and smiled. Ayame didn't understand, but as the days passed and she continued her stay at the monastery, She found herself repeatedly drawn to Ren's useless mirror. She would stand before it, searching for her reflection, finding almost nothing. It was deeply unsettling. Every other mirror showed her who she was, or at least showed her what she looked like. This mirror showed nothing. After a week, Ayame mentioned her frustration to Ren. "I hate your mirror. I keep looking into it hoping to see myself, but there's nothing there." "And what does that nothing teach you?" Ren asked. "That the mirror is broken." "Or that you're looking for the wrong thing," Ren suggested. "Every mirror you've ever looked into has shown you your face, your hair, your features. You've spent years studying that reflection, knowing exactly what you look like. My mirror can't show you that, so it forces you to consider, if you can't see your face, what else might you see? If appearance isn't available, what remains?" Ayame thought about this. When she looked into normal mirrors, she saw features she judged. Eyes too small, nose too sharp, skin not smooth enough. She saw an image she tried to perfect, control, improve. The looking was never really seeing. It was evaluating, criticizing, trying to manage how others would perceive her. But in Ren's dark mirror, there was nothing to evaluate, no features to judge, no appearance to control. Just dark surface and, if she looked very carefully, the barest hint of a form. Not details, just presence. "What do you see when you look in your mirror?" Ayame asked Ren. "Nothing that can be improved or criticized," Ren replied. "Nothing that age can diminish or beauty can enhance. Just the simple fact of being here, looking. The mirror that shows everything tempts you to judge what you see. The mirror that shows nothing releases you from judgment." She came to stand beside Ayame before the dark mirror. "Look at us now, standing here together. Can you see our faces?" "Barely," Ayame admitted. "Can you tell which of us is more beautiful?" "No." "Can you see our ages, our features, the details that usually define us?" "No." "Then we stand equal before this mirror," Ren said. "Not as beautiful or plain, young or old, but simply as two beings, present in this moment. The mirror that shows nothing strips away all the superficial ways we distinguish ourselves and leaves only the essential fact: we are here." Over the following weeks, Ayame found herself looking into Ren's mirror more than any of the clear mirrors in the monastery. At first, this puzzled her. Why would she choose the mirror that showed nothing? But gradually she understood. She was tired of the constant judgment that came with seeing her reflection clearly. Tired of always evaluating, always trying to improve, always wondering if she looked acceptable. The dark mirror gave her relief from all that. It let her be present without being perceived, even by herself. It let her exist without the burden of appearance. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Ayame told Ren one morning. "The mirror that shows nothing is actually showing me something very important. That I exist independent of how I look. That there's a me underneath or beyond appearance. I've spent so many years focused on my reflection that I forgot there's someone doing the looking." Ren nodded with satisfaction. "The mirror that shows everything directs your attention outward, to surface and appearance. The mirror that shows nothing directs your attention inward, to the awareness that's looking. One mirror shows you an object to be evaluated. The other mirror reveals you as a subject who is aware." She touched the darkened surface gently. Most people think a mirror's value is in how clearly it reflects. But sometimes a mirror's greatest value is in what it doesn't show. The absence of reflection can teach what the presence of reflection never could. Ayame stayed at the monastery for 6 months, and during that time, her relationship with mirrors changed completely. She no longer felt compelled to check her reflection constantly. When she did look in clear mirrors, she no longer saw an image to be judged, but simply a face, no more or less significant than any other face. "Your dark mirror freed me," she told Ren when she prepared to leave. "I thought I needed to see myself clearly to know who I was, but actually, seeing myself clearly kept me trapped in appearance, in judgment, in the endless work of managing how I looked. Your mirror that showed nothing helped me discover the me that exists beyond appearance." After Ayame left, other students asked Ren about the mirror's teaching. "Why not just remove all mirrors?" one asked. "If the point is to free people from attachment to appearance, why have mirrors at all?" "Because running from mirrors is still being controlled by them," Ren explained. "The person who avoids all mirrors is as attached to appearance as the person who constantly looks. They're just attached to not looking rather than to looking. The dark mirror teaches something different. It teaches how to look without judgment, how to be aware of appearance without being enslaved by it." She held up the darkened mirror for the students to see. "This mirror shows that appearance and essence are not the same. The clear mirror shows you appearance so clearly that you might mistake it for essence. This dark mirror removes appearance and asks, what remains? What are you when you can't see your face? That question leads to wisdom." A philosophical student asked, "But isn't the dark mirror just another form of illusion? It hides reality rather than revealing it." "Does it?" Ren replied. "The clear mirror shows you how light reflects off your features at this particular moment from this particular angle. Is that reality? Or is that also just one kind of information, one kind of seeing? The dark mirror shows you something the clear mirror can't. Your existence independent of your reflection. Both mirrors have their uses. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from each what it has to teach." Years later, when Ren was dying, she gave the darkened mirror to her successor with specific instructions. "Keep this mirror, even though students will mock it, even though visitors will offer to replace it. This mirror teaches what cannot be taught in words, that sometimes absence reveals more than presence, that sometimes nothing shows more than everything, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from what we cannot see rather than from what we can." Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine looking into a mirror that shows nothing, not because the mirror is broken, but because it's teaching you something that clear mirrors never could. Without your reflection to evaluate and judge, what remains? Without your appearance to manage and improve, who are you? The mirror that shows nothing is inviting you to meet yourself beyond surface, beyond image, beyond all the ways you've learned to see yourself through others' eyes. In the dark mirror, there's just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being here without needing to look any particular way. Rest now in the dark mirror's teaching. Let yourself be unseen, unreflected, undefined by appearance. Let yourself exist in the space beyond image, where judgment can't reach, where evaluation has no meaning, where you simply are without needing to be any particular way. The mirror shows nothing, and in that nothing, everything essential is revealed. Sleep in that revelation tonight. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly, whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes." The execution wasn't clean. The execution was finally clean, the elder replied. Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence. Another guest agreed. I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection. Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. I thought mastery meant perfect execution, Soho told his students later. I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive, but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans. He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence. One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path, Soho replied. Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence. He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough, you've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better, yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village known for pottery, there lived a potter named Masao who had studied for decades under the greatest masters. He created bowls, cups, and vessels of exceptional quality, each piece perfectly formed, perfectly glazed, perfectly fired. His work was sought after by tea masters and collectors, and he took enormous pride in never releasing a flawed piece. Any pot that emerged from the kiln with even the slightest imperfection, Masao would destroy immediately. A hairline crack, an uneven glaze, a slight asymmetry, these were intolerable failures in his eyes. His studio floor was littered with shards of pieces that hadn't met his exacting standards. One day, Masao created a tea bowl for the most important commission of his life. The provincial governor had requested a ceremonial bowl for an upcoming tea gathering with the emperor. Masao worked on this bowl for weeks, preparing the clay with unusual care, forming it with absolute precision, applying the glaze with perfect evenness. When he opened the kiln after firing, his heart sank. The bowl was magnificent in form, perfect in proportion, beautiful in color. But there, running from the rim down the side, was a crack. Not a dramatic break, but a fine line that compromised the bowl's perfection. Masao's first instinct was to smash it immediately, as he did with all flawed work. But the deadline was close, and he had no time to create another bowl of this quality. He sat staring at the cracked bowl, torn between his standards and his practical needs. Finally, he decided to show it to the governor and explain the situation, offering to work day and night to create a replacement. When he presented the bowl and apologized for its flaw, the governor examined it carefully. "This crack," the governor said, tracing it with his finger. "It's interesting. It adds something to the piece. It makes it unique." "It makes it flawed," Masao protested. "A tea bowl should be perfect. This crack means the bowl could fail, could break apart entirely. It's a structural weakness." "Or it's a story," the governor replied. "This bowl is telling us something, that even in our most careful efforts, nature has its own say. The fire does what it will. The clay responds according to its own nature. Your perfect technique met forces beyond your control, and this crack is the conversation between them." He held the bowl up to the light. "I think I'll use this bowl for the emperor's tea." A perfect bowl says nothing except, "Look how skilled the potter is." This bowl says something more interesting. "Look how skill and accident can create something neither could create alone." Masao was unconvinced but had no choice. The governor kept the cracked bowl. On the day of the emperor's visit, Masao attended the tea ceremony, anxious about his flawed work being used in such an important context. The emperor held the bowl, examining it from every angle. He paused at the crack, running his thumb along it thoughtfully. Masao held his breath, certain his reputation was about to be destroyed. "This crack," the emperor said finally, "is the most honest thing in this entire ceremony. Everything else is pretending to be perfect. The precise movements, the practiced words, the carefully arranged flowers. But this bowl admits it's not perfect. It shows its vulnerability. And in doing so, it invites us to be real rather than ceremonial." He looked directly at Masao. "Did you make this crack deliberately?" "No, Your Majesty," Masao admitted. "It's a flaw. I almost destroyed the bowl because of it." "Then it's a gift," the emperor replied. "A deliberate crack would be pretentious, a manufactured authenticity. But this crack happened. The bowl is showing us the truth of its making, that fire and clay have their own will, that perfection is an illusion, that beauty can include what we consider flaws." After the ceremony, a renowned tea master approached Masao. "That bowl is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's cracked," Masao said, still unable to accept this interpretation. "Exactly," the tea master replied. "Your perfect bowls are impressive but distant. They're so perfect they feel inhuman, unreal. But this bowl with its crack is approachable. It's marked by the actual process of its creation. It doesn't pretend to be more than what it is, clay and glaze and fire meeting imperfectly." He held the bowl carefully. "In the tea ceremony, we value wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Your perfect bowls violate wabi-sabi. They're trying too hard to be permanent, complete, perfect. This cracked bowl embodies wabi-sabi perfectly. It shows age before it's even been used. It admits its fragility. It's honest." Over the following weeks, Masao struggled with this new perspective. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of perfection, on the elimination of flaws. Now he was being told that his flawed bowl was his finest work precisely because of its flaw. He began to experiment. He still created bowls with his full skill and attention, but he stopped destroying pieces that emerged with cracks, asymmetries, or irregularities. He studied these flawed pieces, trying to understand what made some flaws interesting and others merely defects. He discovered something subtle. There were flaws that came from carelessness or poor technique, and these did diminish the work. But some flaws came from the honest interaction of materials and fire, and these often added something that perfect technique alone could never achieve. The cracked bowl became famous. Tea masters throughout the region requested pieces from Masao that had this quality of honest imperfection. He became known not for perfect bowls, but for bowls that told the truth of their making, that showed the conversation between intention and accident, control and surrender. I spent 30 years trying to eliminate every flaw, Masao would tell students who came to learn from him. I thought my job was to impose my will perfectly on clay and fire. But actually, my job is to create conditions and then allow the fire to have its say. The crack in that bowl taught me that some of what I called flaws were actually the fire's contribution to the work. I was rejecting collaboration, insisting on control. The crack showed me a better way. He would show students two bowls, one perfect by traditional standards, one marked by a crack or asymmetry. Which is more beautiful? The answer depends on what you value. If you value technical mastery and perfect execution, choose the perfect bowl. If you value honesty and the authentic marks of process, choose the cracked one. Neither is wrong, but I wasted decades making only one kind of bowl because I couldn't see value in the other. A young potter asked, "So should we try to make flawed pieces? Should we create cracks deliberately?" "No," Masao replied firmly. "Deliberate cracks are dishonest, just a performance of imperfection. Do your best work, use your full skill and attention, then accept what emerges, including the flaws. Some flaws you'll need to recognize as failures, results of inattention or poor technique that you can learn from. But some flaws you'll need to recognize as gifts, contributions from forces beyond your control that add something you couldn't have planned." He held up the famous cracked bowl, now aged and stained from years of use. "This bowl has served the emperor and countless tea masters. The crack never caused it to fail. Instead, the crack gave it character, made it memorable, and allowed it to teach something that perfect bowls never could. What I considered its fatal flaw was actually its finest feature." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider your own cracks, your own flaws, the things about yourself or your life that don't meet your standards of perfection. What if some of these aren't failures but features? What if what you consider your greatest weakness is actually adding something that strength alone never could? The cracked bowl served perfectly. Its flaw didn't prevent it from holding tea. It enhanced its ability to hold meaning. Your flaws might work the same way. They might not prevent you from serving your purpose. They might deepen it, make it more honest, more relatable, more real. Rest now in acceptance of your cracks. Not every imperfection is a gift, but some are. Not every flaw adds value, but some do. The question isn't whether you're perfect. You're not, and you never will be. The question is whether your imperfections are honest marks of your making, authentic results of your interaction with forces beyond your control. Those kinds of flaws don't diminish you. They complete you. The potter's cracked bowl teaches that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to show the truth of your process, including its imperfections. Sleep now as a cracked bowl, flawed but functional, imperfect but honest, broken in ways that somehow make you more whole. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. In a Zen monastery, there lived a cat named Tama. She wasn't officially part of the monastery, but she'd appeared one day as a kitten and simply stayed. The monks fed her, and she repaid them by keeping the grain stores free of mice. What made Tama remarkable wasn't her mousing ability, though she was excellent at that. What made her remarkable was her complete lack of striving. While the monks sat in meditation, working hard to concentrate, fighting against wandering thoughts, trying to achieve insight, Tama would simply curl up in a patch of sunlight and sleep. A young monk named Takashi found this irritating. He would sit on his cushion, his back straight, his mind churning with effort, trying so hard to be present, to be mindful, to reach enlightenment. Meanwhile, Tama would lie there purring, completely relaxed, not trying to accomplish anything. "Master," Takashi said one day to the abbot, "why does the cat get to sleep during meditation, while we must practice so hard?" The abbot, whose name was Hakuin, smiled. "The cat is already practicing." "How?" "She's just sleeping." "Watch her more carefully," Hakuin suggested. Takashi observed Tama over the following days. He noticed that when she was sleeping, she was completely sleeping, not thinking about the past or worrying about the future, not trying to sleep better or wondering if she was sleeping correctly, just fully, utterly, perfectly asleep in each moment. When Tama woke, she would stretch completely, every muscle engaged and then released. When she groomed herself, she was entirely absorbed in grooming. When she sat in the sun, she was purely present to sunlight and warmth. When she chased a mouse, she was nothing but chase, no thought about success or failure until the moment was over. "She never tries to be anywhere other than where she is," Hakuin explained. "When she sleeps, she doesn't wish she were hunting. When she hunts, she doesn't think about sleeping. She is fully present to each activity without this constant mental struggle you humans engage in." "But we're trying to achieve enlightenment," Takashi protested. "We have to work hard, practice diligently." "Work, yes, hard. Perhaps not in the way you think." Hakuin gestured to the sleeping cat. "Tama catches more mice than any cat I've known, but she never seems to be trying hard. When the moment comes, she acts completely. Then she rests completely. She doesn't carry the hunting into the resting, or the resting into the hunting. Each moment is full and complete." He looked at Takashi directly. "You sit on your cushion trying so hard to meditate that you forget to actually meditate. You're so busy trying to be present that you're not present. You're striving for effortlessness, which is a contradiction." Takashi didn't fully understand, but he kept watching Tama. He noticed that she never seemed anxious. She didn't worry about whether she was a good enough cat. She didn't compare herself to other cats. She didn't have goals about becoming a more enlightened cat. She simply was what she was, doing what she did, moment by moment, without the overlay of mental struggle. One day during meditation, Takashi's mind was particularly agitated. Thoughts flew through like startled birds. He tried harder to concentrate, which only made his mind more turbulent. He tried to force his thoughts to stop, which made them multiply. He was exhausted from the effort of trying to meditate. Then he noticed Tama sleeping nearby. Her breathing was deep and easy. Her body was completely relaxed. She wasn't trying to sleep in any particular way or worried about the quality of her sleep. She was just sleeping. Something shifted in Takashi. What if he stopped trying so hard? What if he just sat the way Tama just slept, not trying to be enlightened, not working towards some goal, just being present to sitting itself? He relaxed his shoulders. He stopped fighting with his thoughts. He let his breath move naturally instead of trying to control it. He simply sat without agenda, without striving, just present to the experience of sitting. The meditation didn't suddenly become perfect. His mind didn't empty completely, but something was different. There was ease instead of struggle, presence instead of performance, just sitting like Tama was just sleeping. After the meditation session, Hakuin came over to him. "You learned something from the cat today." "How did you know?" "I could see it. You stopped trying to meditate and simply meditated. This is the cat's teaching." "But Master," Takashi asked, genuinely confused, "if we don't try, how do we improve? How do we make progress?" Hakuin looked at Tama, who was now washing her face with complete attention. Does the cat try to improve at being a cat? Does she have a goal of becoming a more advanced cat someday? Number, she simply cats, fully and completely. And in that complete engagement without self-conscious striving, she is perfect at being cat. He turned back to Takashi. When you sit with full presence but without striving, you are perfect at sitting. Not perfect in some idealized sense, but perfect in that you are completely doing what you're doing. That's all practice requires. Complete presence. The improvements take care of themselves when you stop trying to force them. Over the months that followed, Takashi began to practice what he called cat meditation. Instead of trying hard, he would simply be present, the way Tama was present. His practice didn't become lazy or unfocused. Actually, it became more focused, but without the tension of trying, like Tama hunting, completely engaged, but not strained. He noticed that this quality of effortless presence extended beyond formal meditation. When he worked in the garden, he could work like Tama slept, fully engaged without mental struggle. When he ate, he could eat with the same complete presence Tama brought to eating. When he walked, he could simply walk, without the constant mental commentary about walking. Years later, when Takashi had become a teacher himself, students would often ask him about effort in practice. Should we try harder, push ourselves more? Takashi would point to whatever cat was currently living at the monastery. There was always a cat. Ask the cat, he would say. The cat will teach you that complete presence requires no effort, but it also allows no distraction. The cat doesn't try to be present. The cat is simply present. This is not laziness. This is the highest form of attention. Attention without strain, presence without performance. He would watch the students struggle with this teaching, trying hard not to try hard, making effort to be effortless. and he would smile, remembering his own confusion. You cannot try your way into effortlessness, he would tell them. You can only relax into it. Let go of trying to be present and simply be present. This moment needs nothing added to it. You need nothing added to you. Just be here, like the cat is here. That's the whole practice. Tonight, as you settle towards sleep, notice if you're trying hard to relax. Are you striving to let go? Making effort to be effortless? This is the human paradox that Tama never experienced. What if you could rest like the cat rests? Completely, without reservation, without trying to rest correctly or worrying about the quality of your rest. What if you could let go of the whole project of self-improvement just for these hours and simply be what you are? You don't have to try to sleep. Sleep happens when you stop preventing it. You don't have to try to relax. Relaxation emerges when you stop creating tension. You don't have to try to be present. Presence is what remains when you stop leaving. Be like Tama tonight. Not lazy, but effortless. Not disconnected, but at ease. Not trying to be anywhere other than exactly where you are, which is here now, resting. Let your sleep be as complete as a cat's sleep. Let your rest be as total as a cat's rest. No striving necessary, just being. That's all. That's enough. That's everything. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.